Thank you. Good to be here. I'll get right into it. I know we're running a little bit behind, and some of you are itching to hear about Botox, so we'll get right into it. We are going to talk about, I'm not going to get into semantics as far as bioidenticals and that sort of thing. We're going to talk about hormone testing, primarily with the application of hormone replacement, but other applications as well. So some of you may be in the camp of, I'm going to test my patients before, I'm going to give them hormones, I'm going to test them afterwards, and some of you may use testing only occasionally when you have some troubled cases, that sort of a thing. So I think you'll find some information if you're in either one of those camps. But basically, laboratory testing is just a tool. As clinicians, you're trying to ask intelligent questions and find good answers to help your patients. And laboratory testing is going to help you do that. And what I want to help you guys do is when you reach into that tool bag and grab a laboratory test is to make sure for a particular application that you're using the right type of one. Because whether you're talking about saliva testing or serum testing or urine testing, there are certain applications where they're completely inappropriate. If you're using serum testing for topical hormones, you're going to have problems. If you're using saliva testing for sublingual application, you're going to have issues. So we want to dive into that a little bit. But the bottom line with that is if you're using the wrong tool to answer your question, you're going to get the wrong answer. And the worst part of that is you may not know. So that's true not only in medicine but also science. So just by way of analogy, if I ask you, okay, how many rings does Saturn have? And you could say, okay, well if I go to the right place on the planet and look at the right time, I can see Saturn and I can use my eyes as a tool. And I can say, well, I have objective empirical evidence that Saturn has no rings, which is of course nonsense. If you had a moderate amount of savvy as far as astronomy questions, you would know that if you went to Australia, they have a high-powered telescope, and you could use this, which is a more appropriate tool to ask astronomy-based questions, and then you would have objective empirical evidence that, in fact, Saturn has one ring. But there again, you've got the wrong tool, and if you were a little bit more savvy, you might throw a telescope on the end of a satellite and zoom it by the planet, and you can see that, in fact, it has hundreds of rings. Point being, if you use the wrong tool to answer your question, you're going to get the wrong answer. And that can be very true in terms of hormone testing. So in terms of laboratory-aided questions, there is a spectrum of questions that are very easy to ask. For example, am I pregnant? Myself, not very likely, but as a woman, you need a laboratory test. It's an immunoassay. But it's such a simple question, you can go to Rite Aid or Walgreens or whatever and buy one of those tests and step into the bathroom and you get your answer. The reason that's easy is because whether your result is 1 or 2 or 5, you're not pregnant. And if your result is 4,000 or 5,000 or 10,000, you likely are. That's an easy question. If we go to the other end of the spectrum, we see questions that are a little bit more difficult that are going to necessitate more precise and accurate testing. For example, adrenal fatigue. We're looking for subtle shifts in cortisol, and we're going to need to be having a really high level of accuracy and precision. So one we're going to talk about a lot today is estrogen deficiency. Estrogen is at very low concentrations, whether you're talking about serum or saliva. So it's very easy to use a laboratory test that's not necessarily going to give you the type of clinical application that you think you're getting. Let me show you a real-life example. So this is straight out of the literature. Let's say the question that we're asking is, I have a particular aromatase inhibitor. Now, we all know aromatase inhibitors are supposed to decrease your amount of estrogen, right? They block the conversion of testosterone to estradiol. So if I show you this data, and say, look, your light-colored bars are for these 10 people, are their estradiol before they take an aromatase inhibitor, and the black bar is afterwards. And the tool I'm using to answer this question is an FDA-approved serum estradiol test. Now, someone just tell me, give me a school grade. What would you give this aromatase inhibitor? A, B, C, F? Anybody? C. All right, let's be generous. Let's give it a C+. So what the laboratorians using this FDA-approved test know is that this test doesn't only measure estradiol, it has a little bit of a problem. It also measures other things that happen to be in the sample. So what they would do after this is do an extraction process to get rid of those other things that are going to interfere with this test. And then they're going to run the test again using the same exact testing system. Right? This is not how it's intended to be run, but being competent laboratorians, they know there's a little bit of a problem with the test, they run it again. Now what do you see? Now you see a truer picture of what's actually going on. This aromatase inhibitor is actually working very well. But the tool that you're using, if you use the wrong tool, you get the wrong answer. Right? So imagine if person number 3 here, instead of this being a person before and after aromatase, if that was actually 2 different people. One of them is estrogen sufficient and one is deficient. By this test, they're the same. But in reality, the the light bar is much higher, meaning there's a lot of estrogen here and not very much there. But if you use the wrong tool, you get the wrong answer. So we need a high level of laboratory competency for that. Now, the reason for that is estrogen's at a low concentration. It's difficult. That's true in serum. When you move to saliva testing, even more so, because you're talking about levels that are 20 to 50 times lower than what you're talking about in blood. Okay, so it gets a little bit trickier. So we're going to focus on those a little bit today and then tie them back into serum and urine testing and sort of look at some comparative analysis. So with saliva testing, what we want to look at is a critical look at validation to really see, excuse me, if it has the potential to be a useful clinical tool. We want to increase your confidence in that it does have the potential to be a useful tool. But I also want to increase your competence in knowing that it has some limitation and some caveats, and if we don't really look at those, we're not going to understand why it can be an unreliable test, and you'll hear that a lot from people. Saliva is unreliable, that sort of a thing. Blood spot testing is a little bit simpler look. We're simply going to look at it as a convenient substitute for serum testing. But there's one more fact, and this is the fact I'm going to finish with today, that I really want you to see, because it may be a new concept to some of you that's really critical when we're talking about potentially overdosing people with topical hormones. And that is both saliva and blood spot testing are going to give you dramatically improved clinical utility for monitoring topical hormones. Okay, so if you're using serum or urine testing, or if you're doing any topical application, you really need to catch this. But let's start with saliva. So many of you may attend a lecture like this, and someone might get up and do a bunch of arm waving and show you some case studies and this and that, and they might convince you that saliva testing is a good thing to implement into your practice. And you might go back and say, I've got this useful clinical tool, and then you implement it into your practice, and from the judgment of your colleagues, you kind of feel like this guy. Remember the emperor's new clothes, the guy that thinks he's got it all figured out, but everyone's sort of snickering at him, right? Because there's a lot of people, the majority in fact, that would say that saliva testing is really not a viable clinical tool. And so what we want to do is dismiss all of those and just look at the data and see if in fact there is the potential to use it in your clinical practice, okay? So what makes saliva testing difficult? It's not actually the fact that it's in saliva and it's a little weird and disgusting, but at least it is for us in the lab. But the main difficulty is that the concentration is simply lower than it is in blood. So only your free hormones are going to slip into your saliva, so you're looking at about 2 to 5%. But the magnitude of difference between measuring, say, cortisol in serum and saliva pales in comparison to the difference between measuring cortisol and estradiol, no matter your medium. So estradiol is the one we really want to focus on because it's at really low concentrations and can be really difficult in the lab. So let me give you a little example or analogy of sorts to show you just sort of the difference in concentration. So as long as you're with it enough to follow why this might be slightly humorous, this woman evidently thinks an elephant is larger than the moon, which is incorrect for those of you that didn't follow that. So if you can follow that, you'll follow my analogy. So let's just say this large African elephant represents cortisol in serum. That's huge. If I brought one up on stage, easy to see, easy to make observations, right? So cortisol in saliva is less, but it's still quite large, okay? Oh, my